Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of St James Ethics Centre, the University of Sydney Union and the University of Sydney, I'd like to welcome you to this magnificent, if a little chilly, Great Hall for the second of our co-presentation of the IQ2 debates with the University of Sydney. Before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose country we meet today, and to pay my personal respects to their elders. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director of St James Ethics Centre, and I'm delighted to chair tonight's debate. Now, tonight's debate is in partnership with the University of Sydney Union Debating Society, the oldest such society in Australia, and it still holds the position as the world's #1 university debating institution, ahead of lesser institutions like Oxford, Cambridge, Yale and the entire Ivy League. In 2011, the USU is responsible for what's considered to be the most successful debating program in the world. We're very pleased to be working tonight with the Union once again, and that two of its outstanding student debaters have agreed to join us in this public debate this evening. But to all of you in particular, I extend a hearty welcome. Now, there are some basic rules for these debates, and you'll find them listed in your order paper. I suppose the essential thing is to do with the spirit in which these debates are conducted, based, if you like, on a respect for the intrinsic dignity of all, and so we encourage passionate disagreement, but respectful disagreement in the course of the debate. And as you may know, if you've attended events of this kind before, the debate is not restricted simply to our speakers, but in the course of proceedings you will be invited also to take part in the floor debate, and I hope you will, where you can speak for a minute for or against the debate. And I have known those on the floor debate actually to turn the result. Now, you will have seen on your seat a series of voting tickets. They look like this. When you entered the Great Hall, you would have been asked to vote for or against or undecided. Later on, you'll be asked to cast a ballot. If you're still undecided, and I hope you won't be by then, you'll deposit your ballot with both sides still attached. Otherwise, tear it and put for or against according to your way you'd like to vote. And we'll then be able to compare the swing in the audience since the time that the debate commenced. The topic for tonight's debate before this House is that we need a nanny state. I'd like to introduce each of the speakers. I'll do them in a job lot, so I'll introduce all of the affirmative and ask you to welcome them as a group, followed by all of the negative. Speaking for the motion before the House is Professor Simon Chapman, who's Professor in Public Health at the University of Sydney, a passionate champion for public health policy that can improve all of our lives. His current research involves examining how health and medical issues are covered in the news media, the implications for tobacco control of Web 2.0 technology, and characteristics of public health research and its dissemination which impact on public health policy. His book, Public Health Advocacy and Tobacco Control, Making Smoking History, nice little pun in all of that, Simon, outlines his leadership in the tobacco control campaign, its success and the work still to be done. He's joined by Zinn, the Director for Communications at Choice, the well-known independent publisher of consumer information, an active advocacy group and the public face of the Australia Consumers Association. As a spokesman for Choice, Christopher directs campaigns that defend consumer rights and promotes expert advice on the products and services available in the marketplace, while the wider community benefits from all of their work. And last but not least, from the USU, Patrick Bateman, a student debater currently completing his law degree at the University of Sydney. He was president of the Student Union from 2009 to 2010 and remains on the board. Pat's a winner of the university's Justice Kirby Plain Speaking Competition, the Intercolouration, the World Universities Public Speaking Championship. He's represented the university in 3 World Universities Debating Championships and 3 Australasian InterVarsity Debating Championships. The founder of the university's first public speaking society, Pat is one of several volunteer coaches who spend each week training international students in public communication. When he's not working at the Australian Human Rights Commission, he tutors in Australian politics and human rights. Would you please welcome the speakers for the affirmative? Speaking against the motion before the House, first speaker is Elle Jones, a fourth-year arts law student currently undertaking honours in history. Elle was the director of the USU's Debates program in 2010 and has been involved in judging the Kirby competition for the past 2 years. In 2010, she competed in the finals of both the Australasian and World Debating Championships. She was awarded the 4th best individual speaker in Australasia, the 12th best in the world. She's also a Secretariat member of the Australasian InterVarsity Debating Association. Elle's just returned from Seoul, where she was awarded the best speaker at the Australasian Debating Championships. Another great success for the University of Sydney debaters. Joining her is Chris Berg, a research fellow with the Institute of Public Affairs, a public policy think tank dedicated to preserving and strengthening the foundations of economic and political freedom. He's a regular columnist with the Sunday Age and ABC's The Drum, covering cultural, political and economic issues. His published works reflect his research interests, the growth of Australia's regulatory state, the national curriculum and critique, and 100 Great Books of Liberty. And last but not least, Rowan, an advertising media specialist who also runs his own company, Rowan Advertising. As a junior copywriter in London, he launched Foster's Lager and Paul Hogan onto the British public in the most successful UK alcohol launch of the 1980s. He's a regular social media commentator with his own blog and is best known to many of us now as a panellist on the Gruen Transfer, the ABC TV panel show about advertising, how it works, and of course how it works on us. Please welcome the speakers from the negative. Just looking for my stopwatch. Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition before this House is that we need a nanny state. I now invite the first speaker for the affirmative, Simon Chapman, to address the House.
Thank you, Simon. In 2008, the radio shock jock Steve Price asked, "When is Simon Chapman, the academic, intellectual, self-appointed chief wowser of the nanny state, going to leave us alone?" Well, not tonight. I now have chief wowser of the nanny state proudly inscribed on my door, and I get beseeching letters from Fred Nile urging me to retire. This debate can get very dirty. Being slandered as an academic and an intellectual has caused me great shame. In 2007, over 11,000 doctors voted in a British Medical Journal poll on the most important developments in the history of medicine. The winner was mandatory sanitation, clean water and sewage disposal. It scored ahead of anaesthetics, vaccination and antibiotics, and yet an editorial from the London Times in 1849 thundered, "We prefer to take our chance with cholera and the rest than to be bullied into health. There is nothing a man hates so much as being cleansed against his will, or having his floors swept, his walls whitewashed, his pet dung heaps cleared away." Moreover, in the 19th century, there were a good many perfectly legal industries railing against nanny state politicians who wanted to end the slave and opium trades, to stop enterprising businessmen from making money with child labour and exhibiting the deformed for entertainment. But today, there are still many modern dung heap protectors determined to discredit any regulatory efforts that might get in the way of profit maximisation. Tonight, my team will expose nanny not as the harridan of haranguing, but as a profoundly civilising influence on our lives. While you sleep tonight, the nanny state will silently protect you, you and your family, your neighbours, with mandatory smoke alarms and building, electrical and plumbing standards. The food you eat, the pasteurised milk that you drink will be highly unlikely to poison you. Your car won't belch leaded smoke and lower the IQ of children most exposed. You won't be forced to breathe other people's smoke in your workplace. We now take all of this for granted, and Australians have never lived longer or enjoyed better health. And these advances owe far much more to nannyist prevention than they do to the ability of modern medicine to fix us up when we get sick or injured. Our second speaker, Chris Zinn, will paint a picture shortly of the utter dystopia that we would all live in if the nanny state were ever to collapse. So who are those who loathe the nanny state? If you look at the corporations and interest groups who can't finish a media interview without dragging nanny into it, they are the usual suspects, of course: the tobacco, alcohol and gambling industries, the four-wheel drive and gun lobbies, shonky manufacturers and polluting industries, and non-transparent independent think tanks whinging about restrictions which cramp their paymasters' style. Individuals who use the nanny state slur tend to be self-absorbed, get-out-of-my-way types whose main purpose in life is to exercise their precious freedoms and hang the consequences for the rest of us. Formula One driver Mark Webber recently had a spray against the nanny state when fellow driver Lewis Hamilton was booked for doing burnouts on a Melbourne public street. Our gun lobby is still outraged that Australian civilians don't have open access to the rapid-fire weapons used at Port Arthur and in Norway very recently. In the 1980s, the Australian Hotels Association openly campaigned against breathalyser testing. The panel-beating and towing industries had the decency to keep quiet about their concerns, as did surgeons and funeral directors, who of course stood to gain by a higher road toll. But today, the drinks industry campaigns for the freedom of drinkers to get more and more maggot at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, and for publicans' responsibilities to society to end as soon as drinkers leave their premises. Now, part of the appeal of the nanny state slur is the subtext that while nannies might be terrific for infants and children, they are an absolute affront to adults. Anti-nanny statists begrudgingly will concede that the state has a legitimate role in protecting citizens from the harmful actions of others. But where nanny nigglers get really into a lather is where the state tries to protect adults from themselves. Sentient adults, they say, should be allowed to go to the devil in any way they like. So let's take 2 examples of how myopic this argument can be. Today, the tobacco industry is outraged about plain packaging legislation. When the grumpy nanny from the recent TV ad bullies the smoker replies, "You do realise that I'm an adult and can make my own decisions." But the thing is, though, it's not about adult smokers, it's about kids. It's about the next generations of children growing up not thinking it's totally normal that addictive products that kill half their users when used as intended should be dressed up in beautiful boxes. I've never met a smoker who wanted their kids to grow up and smoke. So should we really put the preferences of adult smokers to camouflage their cigarettes with 65 carcinogens in arty boxes ahead of the action to prevent future generations from being seduced by all of this? Anyone 19 or under in Australia today has never seen a tobacco advertisement unless they found one on the internet. And youth smoking rates are the lowest on record. Plain packaging will put a further major nail in that coffin. And what about the efforts to block Andrew Wilkie's plan to give gamblers the freedom to preset limits on how much they gamble? Very tellingly, the anti-nannies actually oppose the freedom for people to set their own limits. Why? Because they know that the pre-commitment cards will badly reduce the money that many problem gamblers spend. And that's the whole idea, fellas. Margaret Thatcher said, "There's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." To her ideological spear carriers on the other team, a person who chooses to gamble without limits is a noble, self-determining spirit, making their own decisions. To them, those who wreck their families by running up massive debts are mere social detritus whose lack of discipline or stupidity ought not to be allowed to ruin things for the rest of us, that is, for the gambling industry. Such people, of course, just don't count, and society is not harmed by financial ruin from gambling or by preventable health problems like obesity epidemics, because remember, there is no such thing as society. I'm delighted to be labelled a nanny. I would far prefer to be called that than to be known as someone in a cheer squad for self-absorbed corporate interests who put the pursuit of profit above everything else and damn the collateral health and social consequences. But let me leave the last ironic word to Noam Chomsky, who wrote earlier this month about the American financial mess. He said, corporate power is now concerned that the extremists that they help put into office may in fact bring down the edifice on which their own wealth and privilege relies, the powerful nanny state that caters to their interests. Big business and get-out-of-my-way types just love regulation when it serves their interests, but they detest it when it gets in their way. Thank you.
Elle Jones.
So it's one thing for a nanny to stop children from putting their fingers into power sockets, but it's definitely another thing for a state to tell you that you should have to pay a little bit extra to enjoy that delicious Big Mac that we all know that we want, or that sugary Alco Pop that we would prefer to drink rather than something a little bit stronger. It's true that Big Macs and Alco Pops won't help you live longer, but they may make your life happier. They may make it more enjoyable. They may mean that you have a funner afternoon or an even better evening. And that's something that the affirmative team and the government has no ability to judge. Because this debate isn't about corporations taking advantage of you. You may well all be self-absorbed. I will not accuse you of that. But I will give you the credit of making your own decisions on these sorts of things. Because plain packaging of cigarettes won't reverse the common societal knowledge that smoking is bad for you. It won't do that now, and it won't do that in the future. Predetermined gambling won't actually increase awareness amongst gamblers that losing money sucks. It won't do that now, and it won't do that in the future. So what I'm going to do in this speech is look at two main questions. Firstly, what is a nanny state? And secondly, the philosophical problems with having a nanny state. So on the idea of what a nanny state is, because the affirmative team in this debate wanted to run away from what is, unfortunately for them, a clearly pejorative phrase. The nanny state isn't just the passing of laws, because that would obviously just be a state. But what a nanny state is the decisions that the government makes in order to protect ourselves from ourselves. So it's not really anything to do with third-party harms. It's not really anything to do with the way our actions impact upon other people. But it is the gentle massaging of our individual choices, the pervasive engineering of our lifestyles, the government coercing our behaviour through taxation and advertising and regulation that is the real nanny state that we're talking about in today's debate. Because unlike an actual nanny, the nanny state will not give you more liberation or more freedom as you grow up. In fact, it just treats you in exactly the same patronising manner. So let's look at what the philosophical problems are with the nanny state then. I'm going to be telling you in this speech that the reason why nanny states are problematic is because the government has imperfect information about these decisions. Now, despite the semi-obstructionist attempts by a lot of Australians to corrupt the information the government has through the census, like the alleged trend towards worshipping Moroccan chicken, for example, I would imagine that everyone in this room would prefer the government to make policies on the basis of things they know something about. And most nanny state decisions are not things that the government knows about, because the government may know rates of obesity, they may be able to quote the same statistics that Simon did about lung cancer, but they don't have the ability to balance that against the enjoyment that individuals get from undertaking those decisions. We think that people have the right to make dumb decisions if they derive enjoyment from it. And as a student, I'm happy, and as an arts student in particular, I'm happy to stand by that decision. But more generally, I'm happy to stand by the right of a binge eater to enjoy eating junk food because they just really, really enjoy the greasy, delicious taste. I'm happy to stand by the decision of rebels to smoke a cigarette for additional social cachet. And I'm happy to stand by the genuine indie wanting to feel the wind in their hair as they ride a vintage unicycle across campus without a helmet. All of those things, all of those parts of enjoyment are only things that that individual can quantify and is not something that that the government is able to make or balance the decision as to whether or not they regulate that behaviour by. Because we believe that everyone in society, adults and children, should be able to make the choice to live a shorter but more happy and more enjoyable life if they so choose to. For instance, diabetes may indeed reduce my lifespan, but I've been told that by Simon, I've been told that by other people in my life. If I value eating sugar so much that I'm willing to trade those additional years of my life in order to be happier while I am alive, I think I should be able to make that decision. And the state shouldn't necessarily tell me that just living an extra number of years will be a better result for the manner in which I spend my life. And this is, at a more serious level, the exact same principle behind why we allow the terminally ill to refuse invasive treatment, because it is something that they would value to not have that invasive treatment impeding upon the rest of their years of their life as they would have it. Because the government can't understand what we value in the time that we live, we don't think that they should judge that, and they shouldn't be giving us the type of lifestyle advice that Simon thought was their position to do so. But moreover, we think that it's not just that people make reckless decisions based on short-term enjoyment. People do think about the consequences and the risks. Think of any Saturday morning with any person under the age of 20 and think about the number of times they've told you that they're never going to touch alcohol again, they have a rip-roaring hangover, and that's something that they never want to inflict upon themselves again. Or think about the number of times you've had McDonald's and felt like you've ingested rubber. Those are the road barriers that already exist to people not making those decisions and balancing the risks that Simon wanted to speak about against their short-term enjoyment. But with that knowledge, why is it the case that individuals aren't the best place to make that decision for themselves? Because it's not just the individual decision that the individual should make for themselves, but it's the fact that the nanny state destroys your future enjoyment of that freedom and individual as well. Because as the nanny state gradually grows and increases and becomes more and more impeding on our life, we become increasingly dependent on it. The example I'm going to provide here is of road rules in Bangkok. So, what you can do if you are a Thai in Bangkok is functionally carry and transport your entire family upon the back of a 100cc motorbike. Probably not something that we would allow or that I imagine the affirmative team would allow in this debate. But interestingly, the people who are the most dangerous to everyone else on those roads are tourists who are driving the motorbikes. For instance, the rate of American tourists who die in car accidents is more than 2 times that of Thai people who die in car accidents in Bangkok. The problem with a nanny state is that it makes us petrified to make our own decisions, and that it means that we aren't able to enjoy, even in the future, the things that we once enjoyed because of that fear. A further example of that would be the recently announced Victorian initiative of the Healthy Eating Hotline. I'm not sure at what point society got to the stage where we felt that we needed a 24-hour government employee that we could call in order for them to tell us, put down the Big Mac and step away from the fries. Surely that is not the society in which we live, and people are able to make that decision for themselves and don't need to be coddled into those sorts of decisions. But secondly, the reason why the government has imperfect information in this regard is because when we talk about things like coercive taxation, so alcohol pops or junk food, and the government trying to slowly guide us away from those things, we think that the government has absolutely no ability to judge that person's capacity to pay for those things. So let's look at speeding fines. An $150 fine to someone who earns $300 a week on the dole is obviously crippling. But for someone for whom $150 is half the cost of a single shoe that is stuck on the accelerator, we don't think that that is going to have any actual impact of them. So the fact that the government is blind to the effectiveness of the way that they try and coerce our lifestyles, and that they largely only impact upon people who can't afford those freedoms, is another reason why the government has imperfect information to act on trying to coerce our decisions in this regard. But finally, if the negative team in today's debate accepted that the government had information that it could even come up with the right decisions for us, we don't think they'd be very good at implementing them. We think that there are a number of questionable examples that I could have pointed to within New South Wales, but I felt that that would have made the debate a bit too one-sided. So I decided to go south of the border and bring you a Victorian example on this. I realise we don't often like to concede this in Sydney, but tourists do occasionally go to Victoria. And in order to account for that, the Victorian government spent $5.5 million on a bike sharing scheme in Melbourne. Basically what that means is you can go and you can pay for a bike, and it was sold as a policy to be the be-all and end-all of city congestion and obesity within the city of Melbourne. The problem with this policy is that it failed to provide bike helmets, so now they ping every unknowing tourist with an $150 fine for using those bikes without helmets. We think that this is exactly the type of example of how the government has bad policy but then also is blind when implementing it. For a country like Australia that broadly likes to think of itself as more intelligent as its leaders, I think we've forgotten how much we don't actually need the nanny state. We can enjoy our own enjoyment and judge that enjoyment for how we see it. We can judge our own capacity and risk within that enjoyment. Perhaps I'm less jaded, or perhaps I think that I'm more intelligent than the government, but I think that I would take my own dumb decisions over the government coddling me into doing something that I didn't want to do any day of the week.
Christopher Zinn.
Allow me to make an admission. Others here tonight might pontificate about the nanny state, but I actually had a state nanny. It's true. As an English-born twin with other siblings, I had a nanny paid by the once generous United Kingdom National Health Service to help out Mum. What's more, her name was Nurse Tufts, Tuffs. And even now I quake in the memory of this strict disciplinarian who really lived up to her name. She was tough and bossy and unrelenting. And if you wonder how I can possibly remember all this, it's because she's become part of family folklore, and we even invited her to come back for a paid engagement. I now know that she was clearly sent to me by fate in anticipation of this very debate. Now, my experience with Nurse Tufts convinced me that the other side focused too much on what nanny takes away from us, and not enough on the many wonderful gifts which she bestows. Our lives are fuller, better and safer than they have ever been. And one reason for this is the kind of regulation and control nanny is now derided for. In my later life at Choice, I've seen nanny's gifts in terms of greater product safety, constraints on the unethical marketing of drugs, and sanctions for shonky financial service providers. Now, the other side may argue economic freedom is somehow the natural state and regulation is artificial and superimposed, and of course they will personify nanny in various wicked incarnations. But I make no apology for saying that in some areas nanny may actually need to go further. For example, it's the law to have Energy Stars on fridges to help you save electricity. But the car industry pushes back on obligatory crash safety star ratings on vehicles which might save lives. The sad fact is the initiative for many of these positives that nanny has given us don't come from government. They may eventually pass the laws, nor do they come from industry, who I'm afraid often drag the train because they're more interested in protecting corporate interest than public good. No, the inspiration for the nanny state comes not from bothersome bureaucrats or meddling mandarins, but from simple individuals, thousands and thousands of them, who've believed something wasn't right and decided to make it better. They are the heroes of this story, and they are, of course, all of us. Now, our opponents relish in damning, and none of them have done it yet, but I'm sure it's going to come, the claim that somehow Australia is the world's greatest nanny state, burdened by these onerous rules and regulations which somehow stifle our national spirit, freedom and enterprise. One of the favourite whinges is not being allowed to fly kites on Bondi Beach, as if this was symptomatic of some great transgression on our God-given liberty. Perhaps some will even go so far as to argue that we need to be free to drown by not swimming between the flags. But it's really too easy to seek out the overzealous killjoys and misguided do-gooders and overlook perhaps what this fight is really about. And I'm unashamedly going to say it, it really is to protect us from our very own human vulnerabilities. Far from being the government not being all-knowing, I would suggest that humans are not all-knowing, certainly consumers. We need nanny for a simple reason. We are not rational players. We are fallible. Our levels of self-control are at best variable. It's fine to take risks, but we can't fly. We are not all adept at balancing short-term satisfaction with long-term interests, and compulsory superannuation is a good example of that. So I think of nanny quite differently, as a benign, altogether more caring soul who might not get it right all the time. And sometimes certainly the communication is wrong and the implementation is awful. But I think we've got to see that this nanny, the motives are generally noble. So let's go back some 50 years to my state nanny. Her first action, and Simon will be delighted to hear this, was to ban my chain-smoking father, not only from the nursery, but also from the twins until he stubbed out his Kensitas cigarettes. He smarted at her impertinence, because all of this was some years before the US Surgeon General's report into smoking and health. But while my state nanny, knew a few things, she didn't know everything. For example, she might have kept smoke at bay, but she didn't perhaps appreciate the dangers and risks lurking around the house, such as lead paint, that Victorian aged cot, or the traditional perambulator. She might not have approved, but again, I'm sure Elle will approve of my mum, who used to drive a convertible Morris Minor on school runs, jammed, I might say, with up to 11 children. 2 in the front seat, 5 in the rear seat, and another 4 sitting on the folded-down roof. We made some of those Bangkok families look like a toddler on a trike. Now, I never knew anyone cognitively impaired by lead poisoning. I never knew anyone who was injured in a runaway pram, or fortunately a child involved in an overloaded car wreck. But enough people were that there was a change to some of those rules. The nanny state knew better than me. The nanny state knew better than the family, because they had access to all that aggregated data of what happens to who, why and how. All the terrible things we preferred not to know at our home at 31 Russell Hill. The nanny state learned, often because of those brave individuals who believed something had to change, and despite the sometimes shameful actions of industry to resist them. So my kids and others now have cots covered by a mandatory Australian standard relating to hanging points, entrapment hazards, and certainly no lead paint. Their strollers conform to another mandatory standard, which means there's a specially coloured brake pedal and a tether strap to prevent runaways. In cars, they've had to wrestle with capsules, child restraints, and booster seats. And I'm happy to report, despite all these interventions, it has done them no harm at all. When we visit playgrounds, and again, we'll hear some people complain that kids are wrapped in cotton wool now, they don't have fun, and all the good old playground toys, slides were taken away. Actually, near Choice at Marrickville, we have a playground, it has a flying fox. Others around there have some of these incredible rope towers you can climb up. Now, certainly they have impact-absorbing surfaces around them as opposed to cold, hard concrete. But as far as me and I think my kids are concerned, they're a lot more fun than the old rusty slides and swings. And I think that shows that safer can also mean better and also more adventurous. And that is certainly one up for nanny. Now, think of your own lives and even getting here tonight, and I know Simon alluded to that. How has the nanny state really interfered with your need to experiment and take risks? For those who drove, improvements in road safety because of seatbelts and drink drive laws have been impressive. And again, while you're here, your kids are protected from everything from standards to reduce the flammability of their pyjamas to even those pesky child-proof lids on medicines and corrosive goods. Now, when Nurse Tufts was with us in 1960, 144 children died in the US because of accidental overdoses of aspirin. 3 decades later, that tragic toll stood at just 3, largely because of container legislation, and that was largely because of a single physician who tried to save 2 toddlers after they ate a whole bottle of pink-coloured flavoured aspirins and decided it was time to act. Ladies and gentlemen, the real scandal here are not the so-called excesses of the nanny state, but that so many protections and interventions mentioned are not available to the majority of citizens. While some here tonight complain of trivial inconveniences, other in less fortunate countries have been killed, injured, poisoned, burned, ripped off by what is branded as the nanny state. Ideally, we could all be our own nannies, rational, and we could curtail that selfish, lazy, careless elements within us to make sure we did fasten our seatbelts, we didn't smoke, we did save enough for retirement, and we actually flew our kites in a non-threatening manner. But I'm not an idealist, and I know that many, myself included, would fall very short. The largesse of the state-sponsored nanny is now well past, although the memories of Nurse Tufts linger on. Our meeting here might not have been predestined, but I like to think she would approve of the state stepping in to fix up what she didn't know or what she couldn't actually do. The need for a sensible, rational and caring nanny state, as I've sought to define it, is now as great as ever. Do we need a nanny state? Yes, and many more of them. Thank you.
Berg.
I'm going to demonstrate that the nanny state is about much, much more than smokes, drinks, and McDouble beef and cheeses. Simon seems to believe that the nanny state is basically every single law, from anti-slavery onwards, which makes me wonder if we're debating anything at all. Of course, we believe in some laws, but let me demonstrate why these laws go too far. The massive proliferation of regulation over the last few decades, emanating from all levels of government, has smothered individual responsibility and, as I will demonstrate, voluntary social organisation. Let me very quickly, however, illustrate just how substantial general regulatory and legislative growth has been. In the first 2 years after Federation, the Commonwealth Parliament passed 21 acts. That's a total of just over about 150 pages of new law to set up Australia's new federal government. But in the 21st century, the Commonwealth Parliament is passing nearly 200 acts every single year, and they add up to a staggering 7,000 pages. So it took 150 pages to set up the entire country, but apparently it takes 7,000 pages to keep the whole damn thing going. Then there's the subordinate legislation implemented by bureaucracies and departments. This, of course, has also grown spectacularly. Then state parliaments are passing reams of pages of law, new and amended. Local governments are wielding their increasingly broad regulatory power over roads, rates and rubbish. Well, I say roads, rates and rubbish with sarcasm, because some of the most pernicious nanny state regulations have been enacted not by serious bureaucrats wielding studies about relative risk, but interfering local councils and their petty bureaucrats. The unintended consequences of not only each individual regulation, but the cumulative effect of all those regulations piled on top of each other have done much to stifle a sense of community, amongst other things. Take the regulations which govern a basic street party, the sort of event which forges relationships between neighbours and adds to that vague but important concept of social capital that sociologists say is the foundation of a healthy society. In Victoria, the city of Stonington requires that all street party organisers, you have to have official street party organisers now, equip themselves with an incident kit. This incident kit includes a fluoro jacket, gaffer tape, a torch, and a detailed map of the area, the street. Another council insists that a professional acoustic engineer monitors the sound of any stereo system played at the party so it doesn't go above 65 decibels at any time. For comparison, that's just about a hairdryer's volume. This requirement, I assume, is why so many council street party documents recommend acoustic music. Now, you can't set up your lemonade stand at your street party unless you've filled out Community Amendment Local Law Number 1, Schedule 3, Parts A and B, and Schedule 7. But that, of course, is only after you've provided all participants at the party with detailed food handling paperwork, submitted your temporary food event application and footpath trading permit to the council, and sent your events food safety program to the Department of Human Services. But don't worry, you don't have to write this down now. Most councils will happily provide you with their 40-plus page guideline to food handling alone at street parties. You'll also have to think about risk assessments, busker permits, rubbish disposals, canvassing the street for road closure approval, road barriers, alcohol consumption, and notifying police, fire, and ambulance services. Oh, you'll need a police background check as well. No wonder street parties are a thing of the past. And the social capital we used to get from these sort of community events are a thing of the past as well. As if to emphasise just how conclusively and irreversibly these councils think that we are all idiots, some will even provide you with guidelines about interacting with your neighbours and how to do so, even some suggested topics of conversation. So even when nanny is being relatively benign, as suggested of conversations actually is, she is still very, very patronising. One of my colleagues who lives in Victoria's Western District has pointed out that food handling regulations have become so rigid and so pernicious that it is now impossible for Red Cross volunteers to bake slices or biscuits at home, which they used to supply volunteer firefighters that are so important in rural communities. The average home cook obviously doesn't have a food handling certificate. My colleague tells stories about throwing away masses of food during the Mallee fires a few years ago when the food inspector came around. As she says, the nanny state now treats home cooks the same as we treat food giants like Kraft. Politicians, of course, would have us believe that volunteering is a virtue they support, that volunteers are the lifeblood of communities, etc., etc., etc. But it is their governments and their bureaucrats and their nanny state philosophies that have stifled those very communities. I can tell a similar story about how these sorts of regulations are making cultural production harder and harder. Independent artists and musicians now have to navigate a labyrinth of council and state permits to hold events. And the less that's said about the difficulty of obtaining a liquor license, of course, profits from alcohol sales have subsidised cultural events for the last century, the better. But leave it at this. Next time you go to a comedy club, just imagine what portion of their revenue comes from the bar. And how much at risk events like that are from governments and politicians and public health activists who've decided that health would be enhanced if alcohol was slightly harder to buy, and that their priority, that is health, overrides all other priorities. Of course, supporters of the nanny state usually focus on regulations that nobody finds particularly objectionable. Car seatbelt laws, for instance, or bicycle helmets. But there's a big difference, both in philosophy and substance, between laws which mandate seatbelts and those which regulate the size of food portions at all Australian restaurants, which is what the federal government's high-profile Preventative Health Task Force recommended on page 40 of its report into obesity. That such an absurdity could be contemplated, let alone recommended by a major government body full of academic public health activists, should be a sign enough that the nanny state has gone from prudence to madness. If our opponents want to continue to defend the nanny state, I'd suggest they think deeply about the patronising and paternalistic philosophy which led this government's august body to such a recommendation. And to imagine that our historically unprecedented health and well-being has all been thanks to some very, very clever legislators is to dismiss the far more important role that economic growth and, of course, its attendant technological change have had in making us rich and long-lived as we are today. Regulators are not all-knowing and all-seeing, and of course, politicians are even less so. But we could discuss individual nanny state rules and laws and regulations for hours, the evidence base for individual policies, their relationship to risk and responsibility and their likely consequences. But I have a philosophical objection first and foremost. Far too often do supporters of nanny laws present simple, patronising models of human behaviour. Far too often do nanny supporters imagine that the primary role of government is to interfere in the individual's free choices. We should not be too arrogant in opposing our views on, say, the less well-educated, because let's be honest about who we're talking about here. All the psychological faults ascribed to irrational consumers are just as easily applied to bureaucrats and regulators who, of course, have their own views. In a free society, we elites are in no position to judge the motivation and preferences of those we consider less well-educated. The nanny state is a model of governing that makes an explosion of rules and regulations seem sensible, even normal. But there is just so much regulation governing every aspect of our lives that we are actively damaging our communities, we are damaging our ability to independently assess risk, and slowly but surely we are destroying our basic sense of individual responsibility. Thank you.
Bateman.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Chris told us at great length about how street parties are now overregulated. I think if there's one thing we've learned from the London riots, it's that street parties badly need to be regulated. Now, our Chris started with an admission. I'm going to be starting with an apology. Unlike my two esteemed colleagues, I have absolutely no expertise in this field. But, as Meatloaf once sung, don't be sad, because 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I think that may be the first time Meatloaf has been quoted in an IQ2 debate. But while I may not be an expert, I live on the very battle lines in the war between the nanny state and her haters. I live on King Street, Newtown. Now, on one side of the street, Marrickville Council has passed regulation that you cannot smoke outdoors. On the other side, Sydney Council allows you to smoke outdoors. So if you've ever noticed why the traffic on King Street moves so slowly, it's because of the slow-moving, chain-smoking hipsters that are migrating every day. This is where the battle line is. It's right here in Sydney. And you don't need to be an expert to see the crucial flaws in our opponent's argument. Both Chris and Elle have struggled to explain why it is that they would prefer a world without regulation, when all the evidence suggests that instead of having some kind of liberalist utopia, what instead we would have is a Hobbesian life, where life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Taken to an extreme, it's a world where we'd be free to harass each other, assault each other, rape each other. Kind of like living in the Australian Defence Force. In a nannyless state, there'd be no health and safety laws, no Medicare, no compulsory education. We certainly wouldn't have IQ2 debates. The audience wouldn't be educated enough to keep up. I imagine debates like this would be replaced with a monthly bear fight or a dwarf throwing competition. Our opponents would presumably welcome this development based on the liberalist dogma which dates back to John Stuart Mill, the 19th century English philosopher, who proposed that society should never interfere in the choices of the individual, unless those choices harm other people. And that's because the individual is best placed to make those decisions. You may notice this is the underlying philosophy of the speeches we've heard from both Chris and Elle this evening. But it is a distortion of Mill's argument, and he would be turning in his grave tonight, so long as it didn't harm anybody else. Mills made clear that when he talked about the harm principle, he didn't mean that it was always about harming other people, it was also about harming yourself, and that the state could restrict your freedom to harm yourself. And this is conveniently ignored by the carriers of the John Stuart Mill, the liberalist banner this evening. And the basis for Mill's argument was that we do not live in isolation. When we harm ourselves, we inevitably harm other people as well. And the truth is, we make stupid decisions all the time that are not in our best interests. We drink too much alcohol. We gamble too much money. We snort too much coke. We elect Bob Catter. Now, Elle argued that no, we have this perfect information. You know, you wake up after a night of heavy drinking, you have a hangover. So you know next time, oh, I will drink and I'll have a hangover, or I won't. Now that's true, you are aware of that information. What you're not aware of is how addictive it can be. You're not aware of how it can impact other people. You're not aware of the one night that it might happen where you are too drunk and you walk in front of a car, causing lasting psychological damage to the driver, to your family, to everybody around you. That's the information you do not have. Elle was quite happy to ignore that. Instead, she said that the government doesn't have perfect information. It doesn't have the complete information. Chris said the government is not all-knowing and it's not all-seeing. True, but it knows more than us and it sees further than us. The whole premise of representative democracy, as opposed to direct democracy, is that the elected officials to whom we entrust that Burkean discretion to make laws on behalf of us are inherently better placed to undergo a process of thoughtful and deliberate consideration, using many years of experience in the field, expertise and competence, and having the best experts at their disposal. The government is intrinsically better placed to make those decisions precisely because of its competence, its experience, and its expertise. And when I say government here, I'm obviously not referring to our current government. Elle instead gave us a couple of examples. The first was driving laws in Bangkok. Now, I actually happen to know that Bangkok has an incredibly high rate of mortalities on its roads. And I know this because I watched The Hangover Part 2 the other night. And Zach Galifianakis' character actually cited a number of statistics throughout the movie, one of which is that they have 55,000 accidents on their roads every year. 55,000. Now, Elle was apparently happy with this situation. The evidence for this was that, don't worry, more Americans are dying. The second example was road rules in Australia, which is funny. Only yesterday, she said these don't work, but only yesterday, the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics released data which showed that in the year to July 2011, we saw the lowest per capita deaths on the roads on record. Is it because we've all just decided to start driving better? Or is it instead because of stringent rules on the use of alcohol, stringent rules on speeding, and on licensing conditions? Yes, they may not be pleasant. Yes, they may be annoying, but they are saving lives. And that's why we need a nanny state. The second reason why it's a distortion of Mills's argument is that Mills recognised that when we limit the freedom of one person, it's often to expand the freedom of another. It's simply a fiction. It's a lie to suggest that this is a case of the nanny state simply taking away your freedom for an artificial purpose. No, it's often to expand the freedom of society at large. And this too is conveniently forgotten. So when we talk about requiring pre-commitment technology for poker machines, we hear a lot about the freedom of the individual gambler. But what about the freedom of the family at home? What about the freedom of the partner? What about the freedom of the children? Do they not also have a right to be able to live under the one roof? Do they not also have a right to be able to live in a stable family without suffering the extraordinary harm that gambling can cause? These are the kind of freedoms that we can expand through the use of the nanny state. It's a point recently picked up on by the US Supreme Court. Now, Chris said that we take too many soft cases, we pick the easy examples. Well, I'm going to pick a hard example: hate speech laws. Now, liberalists hate hate speech laws because it's when the government says, you cannot say what you want to say. And the overall benefit of hate speech laws is to prevent the vilification of target groups, groups that, for whatever it is, shared characteristics, are particularly vulnerable. Now, the US Supreme Court long prevented these laws, held that they were unconstitutional. In RAV in St Paul, for example, it held that cross-burning could not be banned. But recently, in Virginia and Black, it held that actually, laws like that can actually ensure that the target group is more free to participate in public discourse because they're not intimidated, because they're not harassed. They expand that group's freedom. And that's what's at stake with those laws. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I started with meatloaf. I'm going to finish with Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss once said that all adults are obsolete children. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. We make stupid decisions. And it's a fiction to pretend that our decisions are always right and that they don't impact on other people. And it's precisely because of that, that as annoying as she may be, as difficult as she can be to work under, we will always need our nanny. Thank you.
Rowan D.
Thank you. If there's one thing that we hate in advertising, and I suspect at universities as well, it's people who take credit for other people's ideas. Simon, it wasn't the nanny state that abolished slavery, it was democracy. It wasn't the nanny state that invented the seatbelt, it was Volvo. I write ads for them. Simon and Patrick's sort of discourse through the history of Western civilization was fascinating, and this is the appropriate place to be having it, I'm sure, but it was nothing to do, Berg, Hobbes, Mills, I wrote them all down, they were great, Patrick, but they are nothing to do with what we all know and mean by the nanny state. I want to talk about banana skins. Slipping on banana skins is extremely dangerous. Latest figures show that over 63% of people who slipped on a banana skin suffered spinal injury, paraplegia, concussion, or some form of brain damage. The cost of looking after a person who has slipped on a banana skin can run into the millions of dollars, including mobility assistance, physiotherapy, home care. Yet, every day, literally thousands of bananas are sold throughout Australia, with scant regard for the damage they can do. At the very least, we should be encouraging people not to eat bananas without adequate grip on their footwear or protective padding and headgear. Supermarkets should place barriers around the banana aisles to protect their employees, and banana growers should be forced to pay a levy towards the victims of peel slippage. TV shows featuring real or dramatised versions of people slipping on banana skins for the purposes of visual entertainment should either be banned outright or at the very least only be shown after midnight so as not to encourage copycat slippings from impressionable young youth or out-of-work comedians. Fines, including stiff prison sentences, should apply to people who deliberately or inadvertently place a banana peel on a perambulatory surface for malicious or comedic purposes, peel stickers depicting people in wheelchairs, and in traction must be visibly displayed upon each piece of fruit. Smaller bananas, such as ladyfingers, are not exempt. They must at the very least display the banana peels can lead to spinal injury, government warning, and Department of Public Health logo. Sounds absurd? Not really as ridiculous as some of the many health and safety regulations that what we all know and mean by the nanny state has already inflicted upon people here and overseas, such as the fireman who couldn't change a little old lady's smoke detector because he's not allowed to stand on a chair at work. The school Christmas party cancelled because there were no nut warnings on the mince pies. The taxi drivers who cancelled their annual outing for needy kids because each cab would need a risk assessment, each child would have to be accompanied by an adult, and each adult would, of course, need a 6-week criminal record check. A mother fined for feeding the ducks at her local park because of complaints about children slipping over on their way to school on duck poo. The library where you can take your laptop, but you can't plug it in without an electrician's license. The school where kids can bring frisbees to the playground, but they can't throw them. They have to run across to each other and pass them across. Council workers permitted to enter people's homes to check that the children's toys are safe to play with. A policewoman banned from looking after her neighbour's child because she was not a registered childminder. Parents not allowed to drop their kids off outside the school in order to encourage them to walk up the hill to tackle child obesity. And of course, we're all familiar with the endless repeated warnings on railway platforms. Do not stand near the yellow line as the train approaches. Do not stand near the yellow line as the train approaches. Please be careful, as the platform could be wet if it rains. Hold on to the handrail. Do we need this stuff? Do we really need? Are we not capable of recognizing what a handrail is, what to do with it? Are we not capable of recognizing, for example, one example, chips at one school were banned because they are too thin. Thinner chips are less healthy than fatter chips. Do we need to have this as regulation? Of course not. But the nanny state is a bit like the Rolling Stones. It's a powerful, well-funded, gigantic machine that had a couple of great ideas back in the 60s and now doesn't know when to stop. Once you've moved past the early hits, namely tobacco and smoke alarms, you quickly enter a world of Alice in Wonderland silliness and absurdity. A world where control of our own lifestyle choices has been handed over to an undemocratic cabal of academics and bureaucrats who have a vested interest in constantly coming up with new controls on our behaviour. Because the areas where a nanny state can interfere are literally infinite. Recently, the alcohol industry buckled to pressure to put health warnings onto bottles of booze. What next? Cirrhotic livers and peptic ulcers plastered all over every six-pack of Tui's and every bottle of Jacob's Creek? Graphic images of the morbidly obese on every Big Mac wrapper? Photos of dying diabetics on your Tim Tams? It's the nanny state that has become intoxicated with its own success stories and never knows when it's had enough. The nanny state that, like a drunk at a party, goes on prodding you in the chest saying, and another thing, you can't do this and you can't do that, don't do this. There is no activity anywhere that is enjoyable, challenging, adventurous, or pleasurable that could not, somehow or other, require a government health restriction, warning, or regulation slapped on it. In the name of public health, health and safety, and so on, an unelected, unaccountable mix of well-meaning and very well-funded academics, at the behest of Jobs for Life bureaucrats and public servants, are able to sneak new legislation through the back door of government-marked nanny and impose upon us, without any say or electoral mandate, their ideas and their decisions. Governments, what's wrong with this, you might say? Well, governments have limited resources. Sadly, every hour and every dollar wasted on this patronising nanny state frivolity is time and money our public servants are not spending on the things that actually matter, like helping the elderly, fixing up mental health, providing carers for the disabled, building new hospitals, and genuinely looking after those in need. Nicola Roxon recently devoted hours and hours of media time boasting about her plain packaging legislation. When was the last time you actually saw her open a new mental health wing of a hospital? There is a dark, sinister side as well, which has come to light recently. In the London riots, the father of a teenage looter blamed her complete lack of morality, her inability to decide for herself what is right and what is wrong, upon, his words, the nanny state. Parents, he said, like himself, are powerless to discipline their children for fear of being reported to social authorities or the police. Every time he tries to criticise or correct his daughter's behaviour, she loudly accuses him of either verbal or physical abuse. So, whether you intend to work in education, in the alcohol industry, the food or hospitality industry, IT, the entertainment industry, sports, or simply look forward to taking pride in your everyday skills and activities, such as bringing up your kids or dropping them off at school, you should be afraid. The nanny state, by definition, can never be satisfied because there is no end to the things that might just possibly pose a threat to us. It's called being human. Beware, the nanny state can seriously damage your democratic health. Thank you.
Now your opportunity to speak in this debate. I'm hoping, given the composition of the audience, there'll be some who want to chance your arm with an opportunity to sway the audience to your point of view, whether you're for or against the motion. So you're speaking for the motion?
For, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And my question actually goes to the last speaker on the against side. I thought it was really interesting, your point about how you were in favour of more hospitals, support for people with disabilities, support for mental health, all things about treating things, a lot of which could be prevented. Why are you so opposed to prevention but so in favour of treatment?
Okay, Rowan.
What I'm in favour of is sensible policy. Clearly, many of the examples we've given show the nanny state at its very worst. The question is, do we need a nanny state? The answer is obviously we don't need a nanny state when the nanny state is wasting time, wasting money, wasting taxpayers' resources on things that can clearly be seen to be frivolous, as opposed to things, the tough decisions that actually need doing, like building hospitals. So whether that answers your question, I can't say.
Somebody wish to speak against the motion?
I'd just like to say, in addressing the idea of the whole benignity of the nanny state, one idea, or one at least presentation of the end goal of the nanny state would be the war on drugs in the way that is currently being policed. The war on drugs is, in essence, the artifice of the nanny state writ large. People not being able to make decisions about what they consume or how they consume it for their own rights. And we see, in fact, instead of saving people's lives, the war on drugs kills hundreds of thousands and imprisons millions worldwide, both relieving those who it's killed of their life and relieving those who are in prison of their liberty. So for all of the arguments towards the overall benignity of the nanny state, you see there's a certain degree of blindness towards the overall outcomes of what people are pursuing, if by good intent or not, purely because public choice theory also applies to this situation. The nanny state and the people involved in the nanny state, though they may be experts, are still have biases applied to them, still have the same potential blinders that everyone else does. The argument against the nanny state purely is that individuals in most circumstances tend to know what's better for themselves.
Thank you. Feel free to applaud the speakers from the floor too if you want to. Well, you well-funded academics there who are going to interfere. I mean, there's a serious point in that, isn't it? It seems like a good idea to protect people from the dangers of illicit drugs, but it doesn't work, it's making it worse. So.
Well, of course, I mean, if you look at the historical origins of the declaration of some psychotropic substances as being illegal and controlled, and then you look at the historical reasons why others have been made totally available, freely sold at every 7-Eleven and newsagent and so forth, it doesn't have any correspondence with the corresponding sort of relative dangers of those products. It's all to do with dominant morality at the time, characterisations of the people who use those particular groups and the need for social control of them and so forth. I think anyone who's studied drug control understands that point. And of course the other issue is that, for example, with tobacco, it was the harms of it were not known until many, many years after it was established. If a new drug came on the market tomorrow that was with the harms that we know about it apply to tobacco, I doubt there'd be any government in the world that would want to release it out under the conditions of sale and use and marketing that we've seen with a drug like tobacco.
Rowan, or Chris?
Sorry, just back to the lady's point there about prevention versus curing after the event. I was reminded of Minority Report, the film where they predict the crime before it actually happens, and the whole idea there that you can prevent a crime if you know that it's going to happen. The problem with preventative measures, there are some fantastic success stories, and the affirmative team obviously refer to tobacco all the time. That's a great success story. But that doesn't mean you can apply the same idea to every single possible illness or accident that may come along. And that's what the nanny state does. It tries to prevent everything. And that's not what, and clearly we've seen how that does not work.
I remember Nurse Tuff saying that prevention is better than cure. It's a very simple and salutary lesson.
But you have trade-offs when you talk about prevention, and what we're talking about is some of those preventative trade-offs might come at the expense of your individual right to make choices about what you do to yourself. Because if we decide that the absolute priority is making sure that you stay out of our health system, that gives us free rein to manage all of your choices. So is a public health system entirely incompatible with free choices? Now, I hope it isn't.
What you're putting up is a total caricature of the public health position. I mean, zero tolerance of particular behaviours or particular outcomes is almost unknown in public health. You've given some examples that I think everyone on this team
didn't create the caricature of the nanny state. The nanny state.
No, but for example, the Swedish government has as official public policy 0 deaths from road injury. Now, they will never get there. They could get there if they returned to sort of having people with red flags walking in front of cars, or they had sort of high technology developed.
Point of order, sorry. Actually, Volvo have the zero tolerance.
It's also,
zero deaths by
government.
2020 and have the car designed for it.
But is it also a government policy?
Yeah. Thanks to Volvo, yes.
It's a government policy as well.
Thanks to Volvo, yes. Right. Volvo came out with the car and the government adopted it.
Virtuous company.
I'll just pause for a commercial break.
Yeah. Right. Sorry, I'm just going to go to the person. Are you speaking for or against? For, thank you.
Yeah. First of all, just the definition of what a nanny state is wasn't really well defined at the beginning, so I agree with the negative side that there are some things which seem really absurd, though I would question whether the destruction of social capital is due to the nanny state or an abdication of individual responsibilities which predates that. We know what rules to put in place because somebody sued someone for something, right? But the main point I wanted to make in favour was that, and I think the final speaker on the affirmative side made this point, was that we live in a world of asymmetric information. Individuals have great information about their own wants, about their own pleasures, but they have very poor information about the collective. Government, on the other hand, has terrible information about people's wants and pleasures because they can't know, but they have great information about collective information. And I would argue that the great challenges that Australia and the world faces in the 21st century are not ones of individual freedom, they're ones of collective responsibility, and therefore government has a pretty important role to play.
Thank you.
We have absolutely no objection to education. Not in the slightest, but what we're more interested in is when governments take that, what they see as superior information about your own preferences and decide, well, we're going to enforce that in some way, whether that's through, marginal tax rate increases or whether it's through banning products or so on and so forth. We're totally for education. We're totally for gathering data. We're not against enforcing it and coercing it into people.
Okay.
There's an absolute
Sorry, Elle, and then we'll go to the floor, yes?
There's an absolute difference between the government writing on cigarette packets, this is the likelihood that you will contract cancer. If you do contract cancer, this is the cost that you will have to the healthcare system. There's an absolute qualitative difference between that information and the following lifestyle advice that is drenched in government righteousness, that is, this decision is bad for you. It is the case that we can educate people on the collective information about their decisions. It is not the case that we will ever be able to educate the government on the quality that that individual gets from that individual choice. In that circumstance, we should educate the government. We shouldn't educate the government something they'll never know.
You would say that it's okay to say that it's harmful, but not that it's bad, is that right?
It's fine to say what the harms could possibly be and let that individual weigh up that risk against their enjoyment.
So it's okay to put it in writing on the pack, but not to sort of give people as kind of a cinematographic tour inside their body.
I have no problem with non-judgmental advice.
I think that's slightly inconsistent with the idea that earlier this team was so concerned about government wasting money. If there's one way to waste money, it's to take piecemeal measures like simply trying to educate the public, spend millions and millions of dollars trying to inform people about the risks of cigarettes instead of actually tackling the problem full stop, saving a huge amount of money for the public healthcare system and also saving millions of lives. So.
Sir.
Patrick, sorry, if I may. Patrick, this isn't a debate about tobacco and smoking. This is a debate about the nanny state. And your one as I said, greatest hit is tobacco and possibly smoke alarms. But beyond that, the nanny state has interfered in so many areas to be preventative. It has caused more problems than it has solved.
Okay, let's go to the gentleman in the auditorium. You're speaking against the motion, is that right?
Yes, against the motion.
Okay.
I, for one, enjoyed this debate. I'm glad that I could manage to pull myself away from a pokey long enough to actually attend here this evening. Personally, I think that the affirmative was facing a real uphill battle because from a real philosophical point of view, obviously, who bears the consequences of my own actions? Who is in control of my actions? Well, I am, obviously, and I bear most of the consequences of that. And I think the point that the government is in an inherent position to be better informed, to help me or to stop me from making my own decisions is wrong in this day and age, simply because we have so much available information. We have so many institutions, we have Choice Magazine, we have the internet that help us make and inform our own decisions more correctly. So I think that point was a bit wrong, personally.
Thank you.
Yep.
Pat, you, I take it, yes, please applaud. You don't, I mean, the nub of your argument, as I understood it, was against that. That in fact, it's not just you that's bearing it. I mean...
Yeah, I think you really gave it away when you said, as good as your point was, I think you said, you know, you bear most of the consequences. Well, there are all sorts of circumstances where, A, that's not true, and in fact, other people bear most of the circumstances, and B, even if you do, other people still bear some of the consequences. Whether we're talking about smoking, you know, I know you guys don't want to talk about that, but, you know, if we want to talk about alcohol, if we want to talk about driving, any issue where the government is increasingly, yes, regulating our behaviour, it's precisely because our behaviour can impose huge burdens on the public healthcare system that the state provides, and which we all subsidise and bear the costs of, but also because at a very individual, you know, family unit level, relational level, we have a huge impact on other people around us when we make those decisions. You know, poker machines, classic example of that.
Can I just ask somebody from your side, I mean, there's been a couple of questions about definitions, and certainly this side of the argument has said, yes, big wins on smoking and smoke alarms and things like that, but what about the person who can't bake cookies for the Country Fire Authority and things of that kind? I mean, do you want to address this point at all as to whether that isn't the essence of what is meant by nanny state?
No, because, you know, I think we said that it's easy to come up with those examples, and there's a great book, an American book, demonising the nanny state, that is full of them. But it's really, that's not the point. It's really what has the nanny state given to us. And certainly we would not seek to defend any of those ridiculous nanny state things that apply, you find in the press from time to time. Some of them, I might say, are quite urban myths, and it sounded like
urban
a few
myths.
of them. Yeah, it sounded like some of the other side gave, I would like to apply a bit more scrutiny to.
Christopher, I assure you, everything to do with the street parties, no urban myths at all. I mean, I've read these regulations and so forth. But the objection that I have with the nanny state is, again, not specific examples, and none of the specific examples that we've raised can, you're not going to, you know, write a thesis about whether they're bad or good or anything like that. The point is, it's a model of governing that makes that sort of thing seem sensible. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Eventually, you add one more rule, you add one more food handling requirement on top of the previous food handling requirement, and then you can't have a country bake sale anymore. And you just add these things and add these things.
I mean, you know, the point's been made repeatedly that as individuals we don't have that information, and I don't know about your expertise, but I don't imagine that it's in sort of foodborne disease, you know, control. And it used to be a pattern of disease in this country and in all countries around the world where people died from poor hygiene. You know, they died from sort of poor food handling. That's very, very rare now. I mean, are you seriously suggesting you would like to go back to those days?
No, I'm not suggesting I'd like to go back to those days because we're actually a cleaner society anyway. And what I really object to is this, this conflation with advances that we've had technologically in wealth and in higher living standards, and you would attribute those specifically to law. And it was just because some very, very smart regulators got together and made us so wealthy, built these beautiful buildings.
And are you seriously against the labelling of food products to show that it might have, you know, peanut in it that might cause a...
I don't have a strong specific opinion.
Rowan, maybe?
Simon, here you go again. You're crediting to the nanny state stuff which is not the nanny state's to claim.
Fixed up peanuts?
Absolutely.
I thought so.
You got it.
Is there anything else?
Just because we've made enormous strides in progress doesn't mean we need a nanny state to interfere in all sorts of other levels.
But if you didn't have that food regulation, if it had never been there, do you think industry would voluntarily put it on?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's called... Rowan, you obviously were...
Let's hear why they would.
It's actually called capitalism,
I was on the...
and it's where people like superior products.
Make your point again.
Yes, it's called capitalism, and it's where people like superior products and are prepared to pay for them, and it's called the marketplace. and absolutely that would occur.
Well, we've just been through a massive debate about food regulation. I would just reiterate the point I made. The other side have sought to stress that somehow the government just pushes out all this regulation. The story behind nearly all of it is many individuals pushing against great resistance from government as well as industry to make these things happen. They do not just fall out of the sky.
Well-paid people.
Do we have a speaker, a last speaker perhaps for the affirmative from the audience? Is there somebody? Yes, please come forward. And then I have one more from the negative if there's someone in the auditorium. So just for the motion first.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the debate. As an American, I'm very interested in this debate, particularly listening to the Tea Party. And so I become a little bit frustrated with some of the hypocrisies as well as the ignorance that comes from a lot of their arguments regarding government regulation and the thought that it needs to be less. And in this debate, I guess, it seems like it's one of subtleties rather than grand state policy of whether the government should be allowed to regulate foreign policy and policy on drugs and roads. And so again, it does have to be in the subtleties. What is the state allowed to regulate? But then I guess it comes down to actually what the against argument said, where it's part of democracy. And if people decide that there needs to be regulation of a certain aspect, something that affects the public, then the state should have the ability to regulate that. I would much rather live in a state that has the democratic ability to regulate gun laws, to regulate gun sellers to sell AK-47s and then have to write a report about that before people cross over into Mexico and fight the drug wars that are apparently part of regulation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a speaker against?
I've actually just got a question for Simon. You noted that the history of regulation of drugs has been largely arbitrary and based upon corporate interests. How can you defend such a record when the creation of such laws is largely to kind of placate various rent-seeking industries rather than based upon evidence-based policy?
Creation of which laws placates industry? I'm not sure I understand.
In particular, laws, say, prohibiting marijuana when it's well acknowledged to be less dangerous than, say, tobacco or alcohol, or various other drugs.
I think you may have misunderstood the point I was trying to make originally, that my understanding of the history of anti-marijuana laws, indeed anti-narcotics laws, had nothing to do with the actual danger, the relative danger of those drugs relative to drugs which are perfectly legal, but it was to do with reasons of persecuting minority groups who were seen to use them. I don't think there was anything to do with the industries involved in the distribution of those drugs.
Marijuana was banned largely to prevent hemp from competing with other competing fibres and to protect industries which produce those fibres.
I understood that it was a lot to do with sort of sanctions against Mexicans and Central Americans who were using it, but anyway.
Okay, Elle, the argument that was put there was that democracies should be able to enact legislation, for example, to ban AK-47 assault rifles being sold or other forms of firearms, and it could be on a broad spectrum. So is this something democracy should be able to do? Is that consistent with that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've been trying to distinguish in a nuanced version of the nanny state is that obviously states can pass laws because they're states. That doesn't necessarily make that a paternalistic thing. And one thing to say about third-party harms is that is generally quite a consideration outside of the nanny state, which seeks to deal with our relationship between ourselves and the state, not to deal with relationships between people within that state. But perhaps on the issue of democracy, the question that should be asked is if we can't trust individuals to do up their seatbelts, if we can't trust them to moderate their drinking, and if we can't trust them to understand how many calories are we eating, why would we ever let those people vote?
In a moment, I'm going to invite the speakers to begin summing up for up to 2 minutes. Some of them will get a chance to influence your vote. Remember, if you're still undecided, join it together, leave it that way, pop it in the box and that'll be counted as undecided. Otherwise, in a moment, tear your ballot paper and cast for or against. What we will do is, as you are casting your ballots, there'll be a few final pearls cast in your direction, starting off with Simon Chapman and then going to Elle. So each of you has 2 minutes and each of the speakers will speak for up to 2 minutes. Simon Chapman, your 2 minutes begin now, and please begin the vote. Thank you. You can start counting the vote, collecting the vote.
Well, as I sat here listening to the other side, I found quite a lot to actually agree with them. There were many examples of trivial interventions that certainly annoy me. They annoy probably most people in the room, but it's really cheap point scoring. What I understood this debate to be really about was about the role of the state to intervene for the greater good, for the greater number, with sort of commonweal principles applying, not to sort of trivialise everyday life by sort of petty regulations and so forth. In casting your vote, I wouldn't want anybody to assume that this team were advocates for that kind of filling the days up with people who haven't got real jobs, but just have to think of something to do to push people around. I mean, that all is annoying us, and we need to do something about this. It might amuse you to know that while I've been characterised as being the sort of the chief nanny, on this very campus I led the charge against banning smoking on the total campus. I'm all in favour, of course, of banning smoking indoors and in eating areas and things like that, but I was the person who stood up in Senate and said, no, we should allow smoking on campus, on the open areas, in the streets and so forth, because it's person's own business if they want to kind of, if you like, go to the devil in that way if they're not harming anyone else themselves. What amuses me as well is the notion that if government or academics, for heaven's sake, highly paid academics, I'm told, that's interesting news, are to tell you things and to sort of give you information and thrust all this stuff down your throat and to sort of go through the back door influencing government. This is all very pernicious. But that if industry megaphones with tens of millions of dollar budgets about all the things you should be doing, well, this is wonderful. This is not propaganda. This is not nannyism. That's kind of just giving you information.
Elle Jones, your 2 minutes.
Well, since our team's already been accused of taking the cheap shots in this debate, I thought I'd just read you back a list of the things that the affirmative team called you in this debate. Irrational, self-absorbed, selfish, careless and lazy. And those were attributes that we didn't think the state should assume necessarily characterised the people that were in their state, because it is possible for those individuals to not be any of those things, but more importantly to be able to make their own decisions, even if they are those things. And I think the affirmative team tried to opt out of this debate in a couple of ways today. The first was by focusing on laws that stopped people from dying, and the second was to focus on third-party harms, the harms that our decisions have to other people, when really the philosophy of a nanny state is about regulating our personal relationship to that state and not the relationships that we have between other people. Because when they wanted to talk about people needing to know aggregated data, there was no reason why they couldn't educate people about that without giving them the judgment that they wanted to tack onto it. When I said that we should give people that information without the type of lifestyle advice or life advice that the government also attached to it, they had two objections. The first was that that would be inefficient, and I imagine that Pat's way of solving smoking was going to be plain packaging, which I think was problematic for him in his answer to that question. Or their second objection was just to say that the public is stupid, which was not something that we were willing to accept, because we told you that the public at the very least has the information that is personal to them, that is perhaps the most important in making an individual decision. But also in this debate, it wasn't just the nanny state saving lives, it was also the nanny state concerning itself with very everyday things that people derive enjoyment from. And that was, more importantly, something that we weren't happy to stand by, was a nanny state encroaching upon that enjoyment, which was only really felt by that individual, was personal to them, and was something that they should be able to define for themselves.
Thank you. Christopher Zinn.
Yes, well look, I mean they should do things that they enjoy, and I went down to Bondi Beach this morning because while Chris thought that Storrington Council street parties were somehow indicative of the state of nannyism in the country, I thought Bondi is quite interesting. And there's a little board as you go up, and there's little red rings around the things that you can't do, and one is selling services such as Balinese massages. Now I think it would be good to get a massage on the beach, but obviously Waverley Council disagree. I have to wear with that. It's not that us people who believe in the nanny state agree with everything that should be banned, but, you know, in terms of the kite flying incident, kites have changed a lot since I was a kid with a single string. They can become much louder and larger. In terms of ball playing, which is also banned on the beach, one might say that is ridiculous, but on a crowded January Sunday, when there are muscular young men kicking around a ball, perhaps a sense of natural civility has gone away from the country, so that's where you have to put a few more regulations around. That's just Bondi. Another issue would be how far does the state have to go? A lot of the good data actually comes from America in this area, and one thing I was interested was about the drinking age. Now, I'm sure whenever you say that the drinking age should be raised, and all American states, it's now 21, it moved up, some of them from being 18. People say, well, look, they're old enough to vote, they're old enough to die for their country, it's ridiculous. It's said by reliable, peer-reviewed data, etc., that raising the drinking age to 21 in all American states saves 800 young lives a year on the roads. One can imagine what it might do here, but of course we would have all of those arguments, and there's various cultural issues as well. Apparently this improvement even happens if the law isn't enforced very strongly by the state police in terms of the drinking age. So we think, you know, the nannyism, it's a pendulum. Sometimes, as in prohibition, there are very strong rules and regulations, but if they don't work, then that moves away. And I'm sure that some of the examples have been cited today, they won't be there. But maybe in 50 years, we will have a ban on things that currently we think are quite harmless. And that is the importance of the nanny state and why we need one.
Thank you. Chris Berg.
I come from a neoliberal economic rationalist think tank. So you might be surprised for me to quote the French philosopher Foucault, or at least cite his work on governmentality, which is the ideology of the way governments interact with individuals. The affirmative team would like to throw away the extreme examples that we've shown. I gave a list of street parties specifically, but we could go through all sorts of other social and personal groupings and organisations that have been damaged or irrevocably changed because of the over-regulating state and the over-regulating nanny. But I suggest, and I submit to the affirmative, that you cannot do so. Once you build that state apparatus, once you embed the philosophy that governments are in charge, or at least responsible for our own personal choices and have a responsibility to alter them for our own benefit, you cannot get away from those extremes. There's nothing you can do, because once you give bureaucrats and politicians and regulators that power and that responsibility, they will go too far. We've seen the way states have grown, that is an inevitability. The governments go too far along one line and their philosophies go too far. So the nanny state is a way of thinking, and I think it's a very dangerous way of thinking that governments and political philosophers have adopted.
Thank you. Pat Bateman.
This feels a little fruitless when you have the result up there, but I think there was a lot of discussion about, you know, great. There's a lot of discussion about how, you know, was this a mess and who understood what the nanny state was. I actually don't think that was the case. Our position was very clear, which is that the state should be able to regulate your behaviour, even where apparently it only causes harm to yourself, because we believe that in almost every circumstance, it actually has indirect impact on other people and the state itself. And the state should be able to make that decision because it has more knowledge and more expertise about that collective impact than you do. That was the basic proposition. And in response to that, all our opponents could summon up was, well, we're happy with everything to date, just no more. And a couple of ridiculous examples of where the state might go too far. And the whole idea of a slippery slope is just ridiculous. We're not giving the government a carte blanche to make whatever laws they want. As I think the second last questioner pointed out, There is a democratic mandate there. If you think the government is going too far, then don't vote for them. That's the whole point of representative democracy. That's why you don't end up with some kind of 1984 dystopia. You have sound laws that protect all of us, and we think that that's a very good thing.
Rowan Dean.
Yes, clearly the other team were at a different debate. We were here to not debate, do we need a state? Obviously we need a state, and obviously we need laws, and we have a democratic process. The question was, do we need a nanny state? And it was up to the affirmative to prove that we need a state that constantly interferes, that constantly tries to protect us from every single thing we could possibly do to harm ourselves. That's what is known to be a nanny state. That is what is understood to be a nanny state. The opposite team sold us on the idea of a government. Fantastic, great. But they didn't sell us on the idea of why we need a nanny state. We don't.
Thanks. Well, before I open the envelope and find out how you voted, I'd just like to thank some people. Firstly, the University of Sydney Union for partnering with us in this, and of course for providing two excellent debaters as part of each team. I'd like to thank Meredith Hall and the Program for Sydney Ideas and the Alumni and Events Office at the University of Sydney. But I think most importantly, I'd like to thank our great panel of speakers, Simon Chapman, Christopher Zinn, Pat Bateman, Eleanor Jones, Chris Berg and Rowan Dean. Please join with me in thanking them. If you like these debates, the next Sydney debate is on Wednesday the 6th of September, and it's at the City Recital Hall, Angel Place, and the topic is that atheists are wrong. The Reverend Peter Jensen, the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, will be one of the speakers. We'll have a rather robust view on all that, I imagine. Okay, so the results of tonight's poll. The pre-debate poll, for the motion, 28%, against the motion, 50%, and undecided was 22%. You can clap just for the pre-debate poll. Well, well, well. The undecided vote at the end of the debate had dropped to 6%. Against the motion, 27%. For the motion, 67%. Ladies and gentlemen, on both counts, by swing or by absolute result, I declare the motion carried. Finally, before you leave, I'd like to thank all members of this House for your support, for your participation in the debate, which I now declare to be closed. Thank you.